Hi, and welcome to another episode of Forward Thinking, the podcast or video podcast that we run in conjunction with some of the best minds in digital government in Canada and around the world. This week, we're especially proud to bring you an amazing discussion in partnership with Code for Canada. Code for Canada is a civic tech organization we worked with since the early days of Forward 50, and they remain one of the leading forces for civic engineering and collaboration within government. And so we're absolutely thrilled to Luke Simcoe and the whole team at Code for Canada for helping us to put this together. The idea of legacy technology looms large over every government. We spend a lot of time talking about what we're going to build that's new, but we seldom spend as much time thinking about what we do with the existing systems. And those existing systems gather moss. Entropy is real, and anything that isn't brand new quickly deprecates if it isn't tended to. So I'm going to welcome today a wide group of people from public and private sector. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome, and I'll let them introduce themselves briefly, to Sean Boots, who works in policy at the Canadian Digital Service, Amanda Clark, who's an associate professor at Carleton University, Gordon Ross, who's a vice president OXD, and Afua Bruce, who's head of programs at DataKind with a storied past in the federal government in the US, the White House, and the FBI. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hey.
So I gave a little bit of an introduction, but let's start with Sean. Sean, you were an early proponent of digital innovation at the Canadian Digital Services, and now you work on policy. I think you were part of CDS before it was really called CDS.
We were just,
Didn't really what was that like?
It was exciting. I think this is around late 2016, early 2017. And that was sort of when, GDS in the UK, the Government Digital Service, was at its heyday. Lots of cool stuff was coming out of 18F and USDS in the United States. And it really started as a grassroots kind of crew. Ryan Anshoff is a really, really key part of making that all happen, who just said, there's some really cool stuff happening in this space. Canada has a huge opportunity to sort of, make that happen. And I I feel so lucky to have been part of that journey from about 5 people to just shy of 100 nowadays. And
CDS in the latest federal budget in Canada is now a fully funded and recurring part of government, right?
Yeah, we're real now. It's very exciting.
That's amazing. Amanda, how about you? You've spent a lot of time in academia kind of looking at this from the outside and written extensively on the subjects of government IT and legacy modernization and stuff.
Yeah, I think right now is a really interesting period to be a researcher on this topic because, I'd say having worked on this now for about 10 years, it's like most of the time you could capture the political imagination around some of the more obvious pain points, like services that were obviously failing, or alternatively examples of how new digital methods and approaches were really bringing value to government. That kind of sells well. But the idea of doing the hard work of focusing on legacy systems that are often invisible infrastructure that is nonetheless absolutely the sleeping giant of effective policy implementation that sets the terms of what you can and can't do in government, it was always treated like, oh, that'll be kicked down the line to some future government. It's not something you would announce in a budget with a lot of splash. It certainly wouldn't be in an election platform. It's really fascinating to watch that change now, where the most recent federal budget focuses heavily on investing in sort of generational IT renewal, things like making CDS permanent. So I'm hopeful, but deeply cautious as well, which I know we'll get into as the conversation unfolds. But it is definitely a fascinating time to see legacy IT being spoken by the Prime Minister, for example.
That sounds like a good bio to have on Twitter, no matter what, hopeful, but but careful. Gordon, tell us a bit about OXD and your work with government in legacy system modernization.
Sure. Yeah, we've as a digital services firm, in a past generation, a kind of a human-centered, software design firm and development firm here in Vancouver. We've worked alongside of the provincial government in BC, most recently the provincial government in Alberta, and a little bit alongside with CDS recently as well too, although not on any legacy system replacements. Although legacy systems were looming in the background, as they always are in our discovery project that we did with CDS. our journey often begins and ends with you know, a core legacy system. And even just in reflecting about the word legacy, I think we're often really talking about the combination of two concepts, right? We're talking about perhaps a monolithic system, you know, as described by, say, agile software types like Martin Fowler and others, whose architecture kind of reveals the bias and the tendencies of a past computing era, right? Sort of a client-server paradigm or a mainframe paradigm, you know, and if you've been around long enough in tech, you've encountered these patterns, and how at a previous time, that's how you solved either computing problems or, you know, CPU problems or data storage problems or network problems. That's you kind of architected these systems as such. And then I think we're also talking about the specific languages and products and tool sets that these then are built on top of. So, you know, and across 3 projects that come to mind that I'm personally involved with right now in BC and Alberta, you know, you scratch the surface on those and we have 40-year-old plus legacy systems with technologies like COBOL, Power Builder, Oracle Forms, just to like name a few things that were extremely popular in their day, that we're now having to grapple with, and maybe a virtualized version of them or something. But so yeah, they're fascinating because they have, you know, they were once the new shiny thing, right? And they have a disposition and they have a history and they have an inertia to them. And in some ways, Honey's expression about, you know, we want to become the new inertia, you know, we're often there to work alongside of teams to kind of replace those things, but at the same time, recognizing that at some point in their history, there was another team that worked to build it, you know, to replace maybe a punch card system or, you know, a paper filing, you know, system, some of which is still there as well too. So I find them, you know, difficult to work with sometimes, but fascinating to work with as well too, I guess.
So Afua, thank you for bringing an international perspective to this. What do you do now, and what was your experience like when you were on the public service side of the house with legacy technology?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I work at an organization now called DataKind. We're a nonprofit that works around the world with volunteers around the world on using data science and machine learning in the social sector. Most of our partners are NGOs, but we do some work with governments through our NGO partners, actually. Prior to joining DataKind, though, I spent several years working in the U.S. Federal Service. I entered as a career civil servant, so really with the intention to really be a civil servant and to really dig in deep, working at institutions including the FBI and the White House. You may have heard of them. And so had the opportunity to really, you know, see the wide variety of systems that are used internally to the U.S. government, and to some of the points that have already been raised. Really to talk to some of the people who created those systems and have maintained those systems and have spent a lot of time and energy thinking about how to still deliver services with the systems that are there, as well as with teams then tasked with modernizing systems, transitioning them to new environments, transitioning and defining new processes that can, again, all bring it back to delivering services to people.
So Afua, when you talk to someone who built a legacy system, like that rare and special, you know, COBOL speaking, have you ever had a conversation with someone like that and said, like, what were you thinking? What's their mindset? Like, how do they feel about being branded as the author of the legacy system?
Well, I don't usually lead with what were you thinking? It's not my style, but really just trying to understand sort of the context around why systems were created, right? To, again, some of the points that have already been raised, they were created for a reason, and no one goes into government. Most people don't go into government with the explicit intention to dismantle systems and to make it not function. And so I think when you start these conversations, you have to be really intentional to say, well, what can we learn? How did we get here? And sort of what were the factors that led to the creation of these systems in this way? What are some of the factors that have led to the maintenance of the system in this way? Why has it not been transitioned to something newer since then? Sometimes that is inertia. Sometimes it's because people have tried and failed multiple times. Why did that happen? And so I think really just starting those conversations with trying to understand some of the historical context, even within a specific agency, around whatever legacy system you're looking at.
So Amanda, one of the questions that keeps coming up, and you touched on this a little bit, is that when we come up with a policy, we want to implement it. But if the people who are coming up with a policy aren't aware of what's possible with the implementation or the technology, they can write laws that can't be enforced. Let's say you need universal digital identity and it doesn't exist. And conversely, if they were more aware of what technology could and couldn't do, they might change the priorities to make some necessary technologies that keep getting glossed over more urgent so they could implement those policies. Can you talk a little about the dance between policy and implementation that happens in technology?
Yeah, that is such an important question. And I think is actually, you know, I began with, I'm excited that these kinds of topics are on the political agenda now. And I think that's the hook that will keep it on the political agenda, is if you kind of broaden the constituency of people who really care about legacy systems. So like the IT folks and the digital people are like fired up about this. All of us have long been concerned about this. But it's when the policy advocates outside of government, the policy teams within government, the political partisan machine of the government in power becomes aware that they can't deliver on something because the systems aren't there, that this will start to be increasingly politicized, and that's precisely what we need. And I think what that'll tap into is a really long-standing challenge at the heart of government policymaking, which is that we siloed off policy design and all of the legislative and then civil service-led activity around policy design from the implementation folks. And the digital service teams that we're now seeing cropping up globally are always talking about linking policy and implementation. And actually, they're in chorus with decades of policy research, which identifies this as one of the reasons that governments often fail to deliver on some of their core promises. So technology is, I think, the sexiest and most important issue that politicians and policy advocate groups, that academics who are interested in their niche little policy issue, whatever it might be, homelessness or pharmaceuticals, like if you don't understand tech and you want to study those things, you're going to hit walls constantly because you'll be like, why can't we do this? And it's like, because the infrastructure isn't there, the data is not there, the databases don't work together, etc.
Gordon, you mentioned this idea of a monolithic system. Can you maybe provide a little example of what's the difference between like a monolith versus something that's made of composed microservices or a more modern architecture?
Sure. I mean, monolithic systems, which again, architecturally we encounter, tend to have, again, been designed in a different time, in a different place, you know, say sort of, I don't know, 20 years or more ago. And oftentimes sort of the business logic, the data, it's all compressed often into a particular sort of layer, if you will, of the system. So, for instance, I don't know, working on our childcare subsidy project in Alberta, you know, a big sprawling database with a huge data model, a ton of stored procedures, where, again, the sort of logic of, you know, eligibility, say for childcare or something like that, is enshrined and encoded inside of that database itself. You know, as opposed to these sort of more microservice oriented modern architectures where, you know, it's a web service, it's an API. You ask it a question, you send it a request, and it sends you back a nice, discrete, well formatted, bundled up bit of data that you can then manipulate and go on with your day, you know, in your new system, right? And this.
But if I'm a government executive who's not super technical, you just use words like microservices and APIs and so on. How do you get to Amanda's point? How do you translate that or vulgarize that into here's why that matters? Here's why a monolith is bad. Here's why a stored procedure will mess with your ability to implement policy. Like, how do we make that? Are there good analogies or clear explanations of why complexity and coupling between systems are bad, and how do we get people to understand that? Because it seems like if we're still talking in terms that we understand as technologists, but the wider public doesn't understand why a monolithic database is dangerous to public policy, sure, we're not going to make the kind of progress we need to make.
Sure. And perhaps it's cliche. I mean, we often use, you know, houses and homes, and metaphors, right? If we can't have a degree of literacy, amongst our leaders, and again, that speaking of our work with recent partnership with Code for Canada on some work here in British Columbia around literacy and digital literacy for leaders, which I think is important. I think they should understand what a microservice is, maybe not how to code one, but at least know what it is and we're talking about it. But I tend at least to go to a good analogy or a good metaphor, right? For anyone that's ever lived in an old building, we talk about sort of the plumbing or the wiring of the building or the materials of the building, and try and anchor it against a good metaphor that they can understand. And talk about the difference between things like modernization and transformation, or, we're going to take out the knob and tube wiring in your home and replace it with, up-to-date modern wiring. But essentially your kitchen's going to be the same kitchen at the end of the day, or no, it's going to be a brand new novel kitchen, and we're going to have to plumb in some new amazing technology like natural gas, in order to get this newfangled, range in or whatever. And these things sound, I don't know, a bit trivial in some ways, but I think we do often refer to the physical and known world through analogy and metaphor to help land it with people who are like, it's a lot of jargon, it's a lot of buzzwords. I don't know what an API is. Do I really need to know? I don't know what a stored procedure is. I didn't know then. I don't know now. It's not my business. I'm not interested. Right. So we tend to lead with analogy or metaphor to try and bridge the gap. And sometimes it works, and other times it's like, while there's a great Venn diagram in Images of Organization, Gareth Morgan's book about metaphors used for organizations, mechanical, organic, all that. And it says a metaphor helps you see the things that are similar, but ignore all the things that are different on the side, right? The risk of using metaphor, because the legacy system isn't an old house, that shares some of its properties. So,
and I think that it's talking about those properties. The idea that I can go buy a new fridge and plug it in, and my fridge will use a 110-volt outlet, and if it's got a water filter, then it uses a standard 3/4-inch water pipe with the right threading and so on. And I can go make that thing modular. So if it breaks, I can replace it with something else. If there's a more efficient fridge that appears on the market, I can plug it in. People don't necessarily, we take that for granted in a house. And so we don't talk about how difficult it is to swap out the fridge in a computing analogy. But it does seem like what we're trying to get to is being able to go to Home Depot and buy a fridge and plug it in, and it just works, rather than having to build a house that includes refrigeration systems. And if you'd like to change your fridge, you got to go get a new house, which is what we're really talking about, right?
And the best thing about standards is there's so many to choose from, right? So, all of these things, it's like there wasn't even there's not even an electricity standard, right? Because everyone was using their own custom voltage or something, and there's not even. So, you often find yourselves in these funny instances where there's competing standards, and again, that's where some of the house metaphor breaks down a bit. We've been living with standards in other parts of our lives for a long time, but maybe not necessarily in technology spaces and in large bureaucracies.
Sean, can you think of examples where the available IT has constrained policy or made it harder to deliver something that people thought should be easy?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples sort of that come up where, things that the government did that appeared easy was because some kind of IT system was already in place that was making that possible. And things that were difficult is just because, the systems didn't exist, the data didn't exist, the infrastructure doesn't exist. CERB is a really interesting kind of like exception that proves the rule where, teams at the CRA or the Canada Revenue Agency and Employment and Social Development Canada were able to sort of like tweak an existing system in order to get money to people who needed it at the start of the pandemic. That's often not the case. And there's a lot of examples, both in Canada and other countries, where, teams want to do a thing or governments want to do a major program, but, they didn't have the data, they didn't have the infrastructure. And often they might not actually realize that until after they've already made political commitments. Amanda, if you want to add to that.
I just wanted to ask a question, though. I mean, on the CERB example, wasn't there also this moment, though, where all the people involved were kind of like, this might explode. Like, we are fully anticipating that this won't work, which, like, frankly, isn't good enough. I mean, there's a big accountability question there. I mean, if the central response benefit that Canada had to the pandemic failed to get checks out the door, like, people would not be paying rent. They wouldn't be paying for medication. So, I mean, I love that it worked, but I'm also like, I keep hearing people talk about how it's a great example of why we should keep using COBOL and like not like, and I'm like, no, it's scary. It's scary that it worked, and that's scary to me. Like,
yeah, no, for sure. There's some really interesting examples too in the States. Marianne Bellotti from the States is like a really brilliant engineer and author on this, talking about how for a lot of U.S. state unemployment insurance websites that crashed under the load, it wasn't actually the COBOL system. It was sort of the layers of like new-ish, but also legacy systems like Java-based websites that kind of live in between people applying and the COBOL system behind the scenes. But I think you're right, and I think the part that's tricky is sort of the reality that like we don't necessarily know what programs or policies we might need in the future. But I think it's safe to say that the systems that we have right now aren't going to be good enough for future problems. And I guess one of the underlying questions is how quickly can we turn around a new system that does what the government priority of the day or like responding to an emergency of the day is. Because the typical turnaround time to sort of start a new IT program is maybe like 5 to 7 years in a typical government department. And it's like, if you have an emergency tomorrow that you need some kind of really critical thing that Canadians or people around the world are depending on, 5 to 7 years to turn around a thing isn't good enough anymore. And just sort of,
and it's also it's like a
game.
regime change too, right? Like the political will may evaporate. And Afua at 450 last November, Paul Glover said that Canada took a rollout of Teams for communication. They rolled it out to all government employees in 6 weeks. And I asked him what the plan was originally. And he said, it's about 3 years. And, the idea that 3 years was acceptable when 6 weeks was possible is something I don't think that the public is quite aware of. But to come back to something Gordon mentioned, when we talk about these microservices, these building blocks, in order to build something more quickly, we often have to be able to compose it out of pieces that the government systems need to deliver. And some examples of that I've seen at GDS and other governments, something like a form. A form is a very simple thing. You enter some data and you either check a box saying, I promise this is me, or you log in and now that data is stored. But there's no need to build a form tool every time you need to collect data. You should just be able to stand on the back of an approved form tool that has the right things for accessibility and works in multiple languages and all that stuff. You might also have one for publish and subscribe, which is simply telling a computer system, hey, I'd like to publish something to you, or I'd like to subscribe to updates about that thing, or notifications. It seems like these building blocks are composable elements of more complex systems, and that, Sean, if we had these building blocks, we would be able to stand up things atop them much more quickly. But the building blocks themselves aren't very sexy. No one's going to say, boy, I promise to make a publish and subscribe system in the liberal platform or conservative platform of a particular election. And yet, when we look at, I'll take an example. Canada has a case management system. Basically, it's just like a CRM or a trouble ticket management thing. But every time someone comes across the Canadian border, applies for refugee status, stuff like that, there's a use of this case management system that's an incredibly complex and it's been around for a long time. Big system, costs a lot of money. It seems like trouble tickets should be one of those fundamental building blocks on which we can build other things. And you should just be able to go, I'd like to use that trouble ticketing system to manage whatever trouble tickets I might have. But we don't seem to do that. How do we get from this legacy mindset of this system was built for one thing only to a more composed system where you have lots of different blocks and you're dragging them together in useful ways? Can we get there with the systems we have now? And I guess I'll ask Afua that because she's learning all about Canadian systems in real time as we have this conversation. What do you think, Afua? How do we get from big systems with one purpose to convincing people that the building blocks are just as useful as the end product?
Yeah. Oh man, I love this question. Also, as a side note, I've really enjoyed learning about the Canadian systems in real time. $2,000 a month, every month. Amazing.
Rolled out in 3 weeks.
Man, impressive. Now I've lost my train of thought. Oh, building blocks, right. So the reason why I find this so exciting is because The boring things sometimes are what matters the most. I often tell people structure allows freedom. And I think this is true for as you define processes that you need to implement in order to make sure that people in your organization know how to get work done. It's true when it comes to coding and to different systems. The structure allows freedom really applies to a lot of things. Now, is making a form that can be built off of repeatedly exciting? Probably not to most people. As you mentioned, Alistair, it's not going to be exciting for a campaign. It's not going to be something that might lead to protests in the street about, we really want the building blocks of these systems. But it is what is necessary and it is what matters. And so I think, as we think about what matters in digital services, in the civic tech space more broadly, I think that we really need, as a community, to really turn our eyes towards some of these things that just aren't exciting, but are truly necessary, and really make sure that we're putting perhaps even more value on those than the other work. I think this idea, I also think of it sometimes as sort of a digital infrastructure. And that, infrastructure, if you don't have roads, you can't actually get anywhere. Are roads particularly exciting? To someone, not to me. But they are absolutely necessary to be able to have communities connected to each other, to be able to get to your jobs. I think the building blocks that you're describing are the same. They require the same investment into what we're doing. They require the same dedication to make sure that services can continue to be delivered even as technology changes, even as requirements change, even as policies and laws change that then require changes to these forms that we've just talked about or something like that. We really need to make sure we're investing in some of what's traditionally considered a little bit on the boring side.
Well, power grids, Texas aside, and highway infrastructure and other elements of public infrastructure on which we build things. The U.S. is spending a tremendous amount of money on an infrastructure plan, but there's still this arm wrestling about what constitutes infrastructure. Is daycare, childcare considered infrastructure, right? How do we get people to realize that we need to redraw the lines of what's infrastructure? Because everyone's okay when the government builds a highway, but they're not usually okay when the government builds like a competing email service for all its citizens, although that's something that they may want to build. Sean, you want to take that? How do we get people to think about redrawing the line for what government infrastructure is?
Yeah, Afua, if you wanted to jump in, I've got some thoughts, but.
Oh, thank you. I'll just say really quickly, I think that we need to also to do a better job of making the case to the average citizen of, saying that, creating a new email system for one agency, that's fine. Creating another email system for another agency, that's fine. I think we need to do a better job of tying it to, if you have people in so many different agencies always creating new email systems, it actually means that the systems that are then used to deliver the CERB benefit don't get as much attention as they want. It means that the systems that you need to make sure that you can get access to your water and to other critical services you have don't actually have the attention that you want. And the pain points that you have in accessing these other services, part of the reason why those are taking so long to update is because we're busy spending so much time on recreating the wheel so many different times in so many different places. Sean, back to you.
Yeah, I think reinventing the wheel so many times in so many different places is a really good way of summarizing that, because I think you see a lot of the sort of like myth of uniqueness in a lot of government institutions. That's like, our department or our institution or our tiny division is so different from everyone else that we need our own very unique system just for us. And that leads to a lot of sort of, reinventing the wheel, over engineering things, versus kind of like Alistair, you were talking about sort of like the idea that you have these like common building blocks, common platforms that, meet 80 to 90% of an organization's needs, but that are already ready to go, that are already being used all the time. I think the other part of it is that, and you see this with like the Notify platform in the UK that our team has also adopted, like different kinds of platform tools. One thing that people don't talk about very much is the fact that in these sort of government as a platform teams, you have a group that is actively keeping it up to date, actively maintaining it, actively improving it. And so it's not just about the building block, it's about the fact that you have a team behind it, which is often not the case for a lot of other typical government IT projects where, you spent 5 years building it, then you're done, and it'll just sit there and theoretically keep on working for the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, until all of a sudden, it's today's COBOL system that is like falling apart. And so it's like there's the systems themselves and the sort of architecture like Gordon was talking about, but then there's also the sort of organizational environment, which is basically like, are you an organization that continually iterates and improves your stuff, or are you an organization that finishes building it, and then just sort of like leaves it to sit and kind of fall apart?
Well, this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges when I've talked to non-technical government executives, and Gordon, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but since we're talking analogies, the difference between a factory and a farm is that when the factory produces something, it rolls off the conveyor belt and someone can now run it. And when you have a farm, you tend to it, you water it, you plant it, you weed it. And if you don't keep doing those things, entropy kicks in. And it does seem like we need to get people to realize that because IT is much more like farming and much less like factories, we have to, when we launch a product or a service, understand that there's got to be a farmer that works there too. So Gordon and Amanda, I would love to hear from you. How do we deal with this tension around the training people that it's not fire and forget, it's this ongoing thing, and that the service comes with humans, but also how do we balance public and private sector interests in that technology, because government's not going to build it all itself?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think the 2 points there, like, one, we just need better education, better training. I think we have to really think about how we define the core competencies of public managers today. And that is partially a continuing education question, because there's a cohort of existing executives who really need to understand the need to think, to Afua's points and Sean's points just now around, thinking in terms of platforms and common components, and ensuring there's interoperability so that you're not rebuilding what the department next door has already built. So that is just a training and education piece. I think there's many people in government, very few, who really understand that. And because of that, the second point you raised around kind of private sector influence here, I mean, evidently, the private sector is going to be an important partner in resolving the challenges of existing legacy systems and in setting up new systems going forward. But if we keep kind of buying the narratives and products of the same firms that got us into this mess, it's kind of a recipe for disaster. And there's, I think, not a lot of incentive from many of these firms to advocate for common components, or for governments to build their own digital service teams who are building more internally, because that cuts at their profits. And I am, when I led with this idea that I'm hopeful but also deeply cautious. I think the thing that gets me most worried is how embedded the vendor capture just is. It runs so deep in government, whether it's evident in the free, quasi-free executive training that some of these firms are running for current government employees, the kind of ways in which they embed themselves in departments and become quasi-employees, so that you've got, the big management consultancies and the big tech firms working hand in hand with public servants to design systems and to think about legacy renewal. Sometimes I think, the government of Canada in particular, and I know it's not exclusively a problem there, but has a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, where we're almost in love with our captor. The very same firms that got us into this mess are the ones we keep turning to fix it. And it's just, it's very dangerous. And I think something we need to really talk a lot more about when we think about where we're going forward in managing legacy systems and avoiding building new ones that we have to clean up in decades to come.
Gordon, did you want to chime in on analogies here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got a couple of trains of thought. One is obviously the role of the private sector, of which I'm a part, and having partnered with government over the last 25 years. Although, given our size and our reach, small but mighty here in Vancouver, we certainly don't have the kind of engagements or contracts to maintain and manage, these legacy systems, the way that some firms that we work with do. That said, I have to simultaneously respect some of the knowledge going back to the materials that I see, and this is down at sort of the developer level, and the kind of craft involved and the sort of practice that those folks have often when it comes to knowing how to manipulate older technology and working within a whole bunch of constraints as well too, right? Again, back to analogy and metaphor, I live in, I'm sitting in a 110-year-old house right now, right? And, somebody I need to come in and fix some 110-year-old piece of it needs to be a skilled craft person to be able to do that. And sometimes we really, I witness that on a daily basis. Again, the value capture is definitely an issue, and there can feel like there's a moat, around these systems. And as you approach the system, because we're always there to like try and do something to it, right, or change it or whatever. And we get to the moat, and we're like, hey, we look up at the castle, and they shoot arrows down at the team that's trying to come and touch the system, because a good day for that team is kind of like, 4 nines, don't touch our system. It's working, stability. It's a conservative force, right? Because there's a business sitting on top of it still. They still have to print childcare subsidy checks in Alberta. They still have to run the courts, in BC or Alberta. They still have to, name any, like, they still have to cut checks, for insurance. And so we're there often to mess about with that at the same time as someone's trying to stop touching the system, right? Get away, sort of thing. Afua, did you want to comment on perhaps some of the tension there in terms of changing systems and keeping them running at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, the mission of government is to deliver services, sort of. Let's go with that for now. And so when you are changing systems, you can't afford to let one of your systems fail. This is just not an option that is possible in the government sectors. Other sectors do perhaps have that luxury. Sometimes governments think they have luxury. I think something that we see from time to time in the US is government websites that decide to close every night for 10 to 14 hours because of system updates being required for 10 to 14 hours every single night. And so there are a couple of things that I think really go into play here to get around this. I think one is recognizing that when we talk about updating legacy systems, we're not just talking about updating the technology that's there, but also the processes. So really also using it as an example to think through what are the policies that should actually be in place, not necessarily what policies are we enforcing now, but what policies, what people need to be included in the process, what people need to get access, and then how does that drive what processes actually need to be done. I think that needs to underscore any type of technology systems transformation that we talk about. It's just what are the true underlying policies and process changes that we need. Then on the other hand, I mean, we have to talk about procurement at some point, right? The procurement process really drives a lot of how do we have these systems in the first place? How do we maintain these systems? How do we then identify what new systems are built and how they're built? And so efforts that various governments are doing to help shorten procurement processes, help think about what agile procurement looks like, help think about what it means to really just look at who some of the vendors can be. Do you need to go back, to Amanda's point, to the same big vendors that you've already gone to? Can you that you've gone to repeatedly in the past, or can you take a look at some smaller vendors who might use different methodologies to then deliver things quicker, more efficiently, so you get down to that quick delivery in 3 weeks or 6 weeks, even though 3 years might have otherwise been acceptable.
I can keep asking questions, but I'm much more happy for all of you to just chat amongst yourselves. So don't feel shy about chiming in on this stuff. I guess my thoughts around legacy are, if legacy stuff is a consequence of monolithic architecture, a lack of understanding that components work better, vendor lock-in or vendor capture, whatever you want to call it, we're talking about the largest buyers of IT infrastructure in the world, most governments, and the strides that open source has taken are tremendous. The thing that the open source movement missed was that you could put a license into open source that required you to give the code to someone else. But the hard part was in the operation of it. Amazon and Google all run on open source stuff, they just run it as a service. And so it does feel to me like we took this idea of open source and then we realized that the hard part was implementing and running it and maintaining it, so that just because it's open source doesn't mean it's free, which was the old assumption. But government is the biggest provider of IT infrastructure in the world. So, or the biggest buyer of IT infrastructure in the world. So how do we reconcile those two things? And I'm sure you all have opinions on it, but Amanda, I think I'd love to hear from you, from the work you've done and the research you've done in this field, how we reconcile, open source, software as a service, vendor capture, and all those things. And do you think we're going to see an upheaval in that model, or is it going to be the status quo?
I mean, I as I mentioned before, I mean, a part of this is a re-education campaign within government, and I think it's like an easy narrative to tell. Afua put it very beautifully, actually. I think if you were to sit down with most public managers or most ministers and explain to them that there is another way, that it, and use I'm always careful about, it's faster, it's cheaper, because sometimes that just means it's like a worse product. But if you say it's as good or better, like more public value, meets user needs better, solves your policy problem, and hey, by the way, we can do it in 6 weeks, not 3 years, that's just easy to sell. We need to do more of that. Part of that is putting more people in government who have that perspective. I think you're really only going to see a lot of these changes if you see a shakeup of the CIO class and the executive class. We just need, and you're seeing that in the United States right now. I have a guest cameo from my mother-in-law. Hi, Jackie. And I'm in her house right now. Speaking of houses and analogies of houses. So anyway, all that to say, you're seeing in the United States right now, really, really exciting appointments to senior leadership positions, people who really get this. And that's when you're going to see the change. If the old guard is there, there's just the playbook is too ingrained, and it can be difficult to teach an old dog new tricks. And I hope we can see that kind of a shakeup in Canada as well.
We're kind of back to the same question that was hinted at a second ago around procurement, though, in terms of the attitudes or beliefs that there's a build or buy decision that's faced with a technology thing. There's maybe something that's off the shelf that we can get, or a platform that we can install and configure, and some people truly believe ultimately that it's not their competency as public servants to design, build, and manage and maintain and operate these systems over time, because that distracts from the delivery of the service in another way, because that's headcount that they don't want to have, that's not their core competency, or not their, not their kind of job description, right, in terms of their mission or mandate or remit or purpose or whatever the thing is, right? And it's really interesting to kind of see that, I've been around in government, working alongside government long enough now to sort of see this sort of pendulum swing a few times, from central, bring it all in, we're going to do it, we're going to be the ones who own this and are competent and are, hold the direction setting and the implementation of technology, and the pendulum swinging out the other way to being what, no, it's somebody else's business to be able to do this, and to the sort of outsourced, extremes, right, where core systems of record in government are entirely run by, third-party private sector for-profit organizations as well too. I think ultimately the context of this is it's both and. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, but the dualism is so strong often, right? And this sort of pendulum swing tends to happen, with frequency in government in terms of IT shops, CIOs, their kind of attitudes towards these things.
Yeah, I think to Amanda, to your points earlier too, I think there's some interesting sort of a few folks are mentioning sort of the ethnography of what is it like to be in an IT executive or CIO role in government, where your own future career path almost always leads out the door to working for one of these really large management consultancies or IT vendors. And I think that changes the incentives and the relationships that people at that level end up with. There's some really interesting stuff that Bianca Wiley in Toronto is publishing these days about sort of the value of essentially publicly owned technology and infrastructure as a counterpoint to the sort of commercialization or vendor intermediated interface with government that you see with things the sort of software ecosystem around tax filing and stuff like that, as two different kinds of poles for how people interact with government services.
Sean, you mentioned earlier the idea of these component services that people could use across departments, but nobody does. They all build their own because they think they're unique. How are the incentives in government set up so that everybody wants to build their own forms tool instead of using the common one?
That's a great question. I think it's part of the sort of waterfall-iness of the processes that are actually on the outside of the actual software development part, where a given department is going to be planning what their sort of future system looks like as a very like Word document, people around a boardroom table kind of approach. Write that all down, lock it all in before any kind of sort of design research, talking to the users, actually getting a feel for what's needed. And so it's kind of like the uniqueness comes from the fact that that's being done in a vacuum without any kind of input from actual users or feedback. And then it gets locked into budget proposals, Treasury Board approvals, internal plans, a whole bunch of waterfall documentation that even if way down the road you say, hey, you know what, 3 other departments built the same thing, you could have just used theirs, it's already too late because you already have $80 million that you've been given by the finance department to go build your unique thing. And there's no way to walk that back. And so it's I think the bigger challenge, and this is something maybe for a future webcast, is how do you de-waterfall not just government software development, but government program design, legislative and approval processes, which is a really complicated question.
I just think like I'm experiencing this right now as a portfolio of projects working in government that have kind of common components across these things. Like the coordination, I think the coordination costs, if you're on a team working on a project, working on a system, sometimes the coordination costs seem higher when you've got to go off and collaborate and find the commonalities to determine whether or not you can reuse these things. There's maybe not a ready at hand thing that's already built. And you're kind of like, your incentives on a project, are like, you've got a timeline, you've got a budget, you've got promises that you're supposed to be, fulfilling on, you've got your thing that you need to ship, right? So oftentimes kind of the future benefit of reuse or even the current benefit of reuse is somehow misestimated or, I don't know, deemed somehow not as high as the sort of coordination cost to just try and get it done, right? Like I'm kind of in my lane, we're in our project, I know there's that team over there, they're working on something similar, but like it's going to take me off of my path, which is like, by the way, strategy and delivery and all that, like I got to ship a thing, at the end of the month, right? So sometimes that gets in the way, just at a really pragmatic level across teams. And that was a conversation this morning with a bunch of practitioners across a number of projects in a provincial context that we were working in, this exact conversation.
I don't know that I can add much more to what Gordon has already said. So I think just emphasizing the fact that, it's, although, my ideal state might be for everyone to sort of build off of these same building blocks. Part of the reason why it's not done is because it's challenging to do it. Not just because everyone thinks they're special, which everyone, of course, very special, very unique. Every agency is so unique and so different and has such different requirements than anyone else has ever possibly thought of. But also the effort to have all of the conversations between different agencies to determine what those common requirements are, and then determine what level of effort is required to build on those, and to do that over and over and over again, and with every change that you need. I think it's important to just name that it's not a trivial exercise to do this, and that also leads to part of the pushback or resistance to doing this type of work. And so as we think about how we message this difference, I think we have to acknowledge the amount of effort that will go into making this work long term for folks in order to then build something that could actually make that difference.
Well, I know you're all busy saving the world and building important things, so I'm going to ask you to give me a 30-second answer to the following question. First question for all of you. Here we go. 30 seconds. This is your recap. That scene in The Matrix where Neo plugs in and then sits up and goes, "I know Kung Fu." If you had that magic brain jack and you could plug it into the head of a senior public sector executive, what would you download into their brains? What one experience or piece of knowledge or understanding or perspective would you download in their brains to produce the greatest improvement in government technology modernization that you could? And I'm going to go with Sean first because he's got a big grin on, like he's figured out the answer already.
It's not the complete answer, but I would just say small is beautiful. If your thing is like $100 million in 5 years, I can almost promise it's totally going to fail. If it's like, I don't know, $500,000 and you're going to finish it in 6 months, maybe you'll actually finish it in 7, and then you do the next thing, and then you do the next thing. Doing things small is always better than doing a giant thing, even though all the government incentives are like, oh, we'll just do one budget proposal for the giantest, greatest thing ever. All the incentives are the other way around, but if you can do things that are small, you're way more likely to succeed.
All right, Amanda, what would you download into someone's brain with your magic matrix machine?
I would download into the brain the ability to, or the knowledge that it's so key to say, who else has tried this? Like, who else could I talk to first? So that you don't reinvent the wheel.
All right, Gordon?
I think, and it's something we've said recently, as soon as you engage with a legacy system on a digital service project, you inherit all of its history, all of its disposition, all of its ways of being, and your project fundamentally changes after that. You know, the kind of greenfield versus like legacy integration projects, as soon as you try and write a piece of data, in particular writing data to legacy systems, you will encounter 20, 30, 40 years of history. And that is not to be dismissed easily, I guess. It's sort of, it will consume you entirely. You need to deal with that force and respect it as well too, I guess, because it's complex.
All right, Afua, channel your inner trinity. What would you download into public sector?
The ability to answer the question, what do we really need to do here? And that could be, we need to find a policy, we need to fix some sort of historical wrong that's built in, or we need to actually dig in and do some really serious redesigning of a system and getting other people to plug in. So what do we really need to do here?
And I think for me, it would probably be who else is doing this already, which echoes some of what you said, but I don't think we can find cross-pollination until we find similarities. So thank you all very much for today. I think if I have a few takeaways from this amazing conversation, first of all, the term legacy is kind of a misnomer. It's more about whether something is neglected or maintained. And the farms, not factories idea here that we are growing stuff and it needs to be weeded and tended and nurtured. Otherwise, it will get covered in overgrowth and become incredibly unmanageable. That private sector, dance with the private sector can exacerbate some of these issues because their life cycle may be motivated by other things, shareholder bottom line, lock-in, capture, change in standards, whatever. The departmental models that we have today are not incented for cross-departmental sharing. You want to get your budget, capture your budget, and hold on to it. And finally, this idea that legislators need to be more tech-informed and policy making and implementation can't be taken separately. That you got to know what's possible in order to write laws, and then in order to enact laws, you have to build the foundations for those things to be implementable. So great conversation, no easy answers here, but a lot of good questions. Thank you very much to our partners at Code for Canada for making this possible, and to all of you for spending some time with us. I know you've got places to be and problems to solve, so thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at Forward 50 and elsewhere. Keep up the great work. We love you. Stay safe, and we'll talk again soon. I just realized I have paint on my face from painting, which is probably not a good thing, but people are going to wonder what it is. So let me just try and get that paint off.